Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the Trinity, one in essence and undivided.
Welcome to our second session of the Mystagogic Gospel. Glad to have you joining us again. Let me remind you, those of you who are watching on the internet, that this book is available, Mystagogic Liturgy, available from Amazon.com. The book that we are using here is a rough draft that we hurried to get printed so that we would have it available for those who are in the room taking this live, part of this live seminar. So therefore, the page numbers that I occasionally will call out may not be the same page numbers in your book, depending on when you're watching this. We will soon have these available and posted online, and so you might end up getting a updated version of the book sooner than, would not be till after we finished, of course, but after we have finished them, we will completely revise this book and you'll have different page numbers. So I just call that to your attention. If the page numbers I mentioned don't match the page numbers in your book where we are. So now we come to our second episodes. And as we begin this second chapter on page 20 in the book, Philo, Moses, and Plato, you see, here is the issue and problem for us in 2021, that's 2024, 21st century. Since Christians are in the world, but not of the world, we face the issue of what is the relationship of the church with the world in which it finds itself. What is the relationship of the church and its culture that it happens to be in? Part of that question has then to do with how we understand the nature of reality, how we understand the nature of the universe and the role of the church in that, versus the way the world understands itself. And so here we are laying a foundation. Now we're going to get to the liturgy. Everyone loves a beautiful structure, a beautiful museum, a beautiful building, a lovely home to be in, to stay in. But everything that is of beauty has behind it walls. It has the walls, but inside that wall it has beams, it has studs, we have electrical, we have plumbing. It takes a foundation. We have to dig deep. The taller and larger and heavier the structure, the more solid the foundation needs to be. So I remind us that in these first 4 or 5 episodes, we are laying a foundation that we're going to build upon. Everyone wants to be on the penthouse floor of the tallest building around. They love the view, and they give no regard to all of the floors that are necessary below it in order for it to exist. And so here we are in these early sessions together, beginning to lay that large, deep, strong foundation in order to which to build taller and higher and be able to enter into the lofty thinking of mystagogic liturgy and mystagogic worship. So let us now, in our second session and in chapter 2 of our book, we're going to turn to 1st century Judaism and the birth of Christianity for some insight into the world in which Judaism existed and the world in which Christianity was born as a Jewish movement into the non-Jewish world, the Roman Empire. So chapter 2, Philo, Moses, and Plato. On page 20, let us remind ourselves of the Jewish population in the Roman Empire. At the time of Christ, there were approximately 7 million Jews who were scattered across Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean area. That would be the Mediterranean world, Turkey, the Middle East, Turkey, modern-day Iraq, all the way to Iran. Since the bulk of the Israelite scriptures and the Christian Gospels occur in Palestine, many are shocked to learn the majority of Jews did not live in Palestine. The distribution of Jewish population in the first century, the total number of Jews estimated in Palestine itself was 2 million. The number of Jews in the Roman Empire, excluding Palestine, would have been 4 million, and the Jews in Mesopotamia would have been another 1 million, for a total of 7 million Jews in the world in the first century. During the first century, less than 30% of all the Jews in the world lived in Palestine, and the majority of those that lived outside of Palestine, 80%, lived in the Roman Empire. The other 20% lived in Iraq and Iran. So while the vast majority of Jews did not live in Palestine, they nonetheless still looked to Palestine as the center of their religious life. It was their temple tax from all over the Roman world and Mesopotamia that was sent to Jerusalem that paid for Herod's temple. However, their day-to-day lives were not lived as Palestinian Jews. Their day-to-day lives were not lived as Palestinian Jews. They might come to Jerusalem for the grand party as they celebrated Passover in Jerusalem, but they lived their lives speaking the language where they were born. This is the point. They were Jews living in a non-Jewish world. They lived and interacted with a non-Jewish world. Therefore, there's something to be learned, both good and bad, from their experience for us as Christians to begin thinking about the relationship of the church in a non-Christian world. Alexander the Great had liberated Egypt from Persian rule in 332 BC. In less than 100 years, the Jews in Alexandria, Egypt, had translated the entire Israelite scriptures into Hebrew, from Hebrew into Greek. The Septuagint, the name of that translation, allowed non-Hebrew speaking Jews, not all Jews, in fact, Palestine did not speak Hebrew for the most part. It allowed non-Hebrew speaking Jews access to the ancient scriptures in a language they now understood. Most importantly, the Septuagint also gave non-Jews access to the Israelite scriptures as well. So both Jews and non-Jews who did not speak or read Hebrew now had the ancient Israelite scriptures available to them in a language they could understand, Greek. That brings us on page 21 to the Septuagint and a non-Jewish world. As long as Judaism remained a ghetto religion, that is, a religion encased in its ethnic identity and exclusive to Hebrew-speaking people, the question of the inclusion of non-Jews within Judaism was a moot question. You couldn't include them. It wasn't even a possibility. The creation of the Septuagint not only made the Hebrew scriptures accessible to non-Hebrew speaking Jewish children, but it also made the Hebrew scriptures in Greek now accessible to non-Jews as well. The question of the inclusion of non-Jews into the Jewish faith became an actual possibility. Think of that. As long as it was only in Hebrew, only Hebrew-speaking people could be part of it. But once you opened those Old Testament scriptures to Greek, then any Greek-speaking person could now enter into and read and be part of a discussion of the ancient God of Israel. The synagogues in the Roman Empire, using the Septuagint and speaking in the common language of its city, began to attract non-Jews. The morality of the Jews attracted non-Jews inside the Roman Empire. They were known as God-fearers. This is a label for non-Jews who were attracted to Judaism and began to attend the Jewish service and actually had a place that was their designated place where they could come and be part of that Jewish community. They were not fully accepted, but they were the God-fearers here, and many of the God-fearers became financially supportive of their synagogue that they were permitted to come and be part of. They were an identifiable group inside the synagogue. While generically united to the temple in Jerusalem, the 7 million Jews were divided. All of those 7 million Jews, while the temple was the thing they all kind of created their identity from, theologically, that 7 million were divided all over the place, especially on the issue of the inclusion of non-Jews within Judaism. Some of the Jews, so you've got Judaism and the question of non-Jews, so you would have had inside the Jews, that's a very marked up marker I've used and needed to get rid of. You've got, in terms of non-Jews being admitted and included, you're going to have those that said there will be others, no non-Jews, so no, and others would have said yes to Gentiles. And so they would have been divided that way. Not everybody said no, and not everybody said yes. And those that did begin to, and then you see inside Judaism, you had some that believed in a Messiah or a Messianic deliverance politically. Some said yes, some said no, etc. I should have put the no and the yes the opposite way, I guess, so I'm not confusing you. So you've got yes, there can be Gentiles, yes, there can be a Messiah. And on this side of this small group that was saying yes, and inside this group another yes, the question begins to be, well, if there's going to be a Messiah, and if there can be Gentiles, what will be the role of the Gentiles in the Messianic kingdom? Will they have to sit at the back as second class? Or will they be able to be full members? Or will there be no Gentiles in the Messianic kingdom? Will it be especially and exclusively for Jews? And so you begin to have those, and then out of this group that begin to say you can have the God-fearers in the kingdom. That will be this group that are going to then hear the Apostle Paul in the synagogues. They're going to depart the synagogue with Paul, and these will become the first Christian parishes in the first century. Is going to be out of Jewish synagogues. Christianity is Jewish. Our origins are Jewish. Our theology is Jewish. The Old Testament is Jewish. It's our Old Testament. It's ours with Abraham, and so forth. And so we're here at this point. And when we say we're the continuation of Israel, it is historically the continuation here through these people who believed in a messianic expectation, which would include the Gentile God-fearers. It was this last group of Jews and the God-fearers with them that responded to Paul and Barnabas, and then Paul and Barnabas, Paul and Silas in the founding of those first Christian missions. You can find the God-fearers. I thought I had it in my notes. Maybe we'll make it here in a little bit. But the God-fearers are mentioned in the book of Acts, I think it is, several times. It'll say Paul was addressing the synagogue, and he would say, my fellow Jews and those who fear God. You see, the Protestant translators of our English language Bibles were unaware of a category known as the God-fearers, and so when they came to that specific label, they just translated it, those who fear God. And so it's more of a generic thing, but it's actually an identifiable group that Paul is speaking. You Jews and you God-fearers, welcome to the kingdom, is what Paul is saying. You see there on page 21, we can wait to make up our minds, but we cannot wait to make up our life. While we're busy making up our minds, we are still living, and we cannot wait to make up our lives. So our theological issues aside, on a daily basis, Jews in the Roman Empire interacted with their non-Jewish world. You could put all of this theological stuff on hold, but in their daily lives, Jews were interacting with non-Jews in their daily lives. The interaction was not theoretical, it was not academic, it was quite practical, the same as we interact in our world with our neighbors, our co-workers, those with whom we come in contact. Nowhere was this interaction more so than in Alexandria, Egypt, the city where the Septuagint had been translated in the first place, about 250 BC, 250 years before Christ. There is no better example of religious faith grappling with its culture and learning how to interact with its culture than in Alexandria. Having translated their scriptures into Greek, how could the Jews translate their faith into Greek and begin a conversation with their city and their non-Jewish culture? Others might wait to make up their minds. Philo of Alexandria did not. He not only learned the Greek language, but this Jew also learned Greek philosophy and translated the faith of Israel into the philosophical language and philosophical categories of his culture. Labeled a Hellenistic Jew by his Jewish opponents, it was Philo's Hellenistic Judaism, coupled with the belief Gentiles would be included equally in the Jewish kingdom, that created the foundation for the Christian faith to convert the Roman Empire. It was this small group then learning the language, not only the Greek language itself, but learning how to think like a Greek philosophically, that then allowed this out of here, Hellenistic Judaism, to be that trunk where Christianity is grafted in, where the Gentiles are grafted in to become parts of the church in the first century. Let us take time to make a side trip, an excursus, to look at this Philo of Alexandria. Again, we're digging the foundation. We're building a foundation to build on, to teach us as well how we can begin to interact in the 21st century and 21st Western culture, which no longer speaks the language of the church, no longer thinks like or in the categories that we think in the church. In his lifetime, Philo of Alexandria was more well known than fellow Jews Karl Marx and Albert Schweitzer are today. He was known across the Roman Empire to Jews and non-Jews alike, the same as Karl Marx and Albert Schweitzer today. His legacy was abandoned by Rabbinic Judaism after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, as the rabbi retreated from Hellenistic Judaism into the ghetto religion of the rabbis. Were it not for Christianity, Christian Jews, Philo of Alexandria would be unknown today. The following excerpts offer us a brief overview of Philo's life. Page 22. Number 1. And an author in their context before any assessment of their work, in order to avoid any incongruous assumptions. We're going to look at some of what Philo says later, because he's going to teach us how to do and interact with the culture. We're going to learn some ways to do begin to be able to understand the liturgy in our lives and in the language and thought categories we think in. Philo of Alexandria was one of the most erudite and prolific Jewish thinkers of antiquity. He lived his entire life in Alexandria, Egypt. First of all, Alexandria was one of the great intellectual centers of the Greco-Roman world. It was a trading hub where East met West, where Buddhists met exponents of the Greek writers. Greek philosophy and science would be discussed in the halls of the Museon, and every text deemed important was in the huge, astonishing library, the Library of Alexandria, greatest library in the history of the world, perhaps rivaling that of Ashurbanipal, the Assyrians. Unfortunately, it caught fire and destroyed almost every one of the books, many lost forever now. With its daughter library as well, Alexandria contained all the institutions of a Hellenistic city. It had multiple harbors for trade, fabulous intellectual centers in its museum and library, some of the greatest architecture in the world, represented by the iconic Lighthouse of Alexandria. It had a grid street plan with wide boulevards and a plethora of temples claiming the allegiance of its citizens, from those temples housing ancient Egyptian cults fused with Hellenism in the cult of Serapis, to the Hellenistic cults fused with Ptolemaic ruler worship in the cult of Dionysius. Secondly, the historical relationship of the Julius Caesar, the Roman Caesars, and the Jews. Not only was Alexandria a city of fusion of science, philosophy, and religion, and of different peoples, but second of all, Alexandria contained the largest single Jewish community outside of Palestine. In this period, the Jewish population of Alexandria had grown perhaps to 1 million people in this location alone. Unknown to many, the Jews played a major role in the founding of the Roman Empire. Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Caesar Augustus each entered into alliances with Antipater, his son Herod, and Herod's descendants. It was the Roman Senate that declared Herod to be the king of the Jews in 37 BC. In return for their friendship and the support of the Jews, Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus, and the succeeding Caesars, those that followed, for at least 100 years after the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC, all the way at least to 44 AD and beyond, the Jews were granted the special status of living and worshiping according to their own religious laws, giving the Jews a special status and protection. That is, they could live according to their religious laws. They were kind of a state within a state, regulating their own social behavior. You remember watching the old movie, perhaps, Fiddler on the Roof, where you've got the little Jewish village that was inside the larger Christian world of Russia at that time. And so inside that village, the Jews regulated their own lives, their own punishments, etc. And so the Jews were granted that special privilege in return for the loyalty of the Jews in the Roman Empire to the Roman government. Their loyalty to Caesar granted them in return the special dignity of getting to live by their own Jewish rules and regulations. Thirdly, Alexandria was both a Greco-Egyptian, Greek-Egyptian, and Jewish-Roman city. Alexander the Greek, founded the city of Alexandria in 331 BC. I know Alexandria was a Macedonian, but he's Greek. Became Greek, is embraced by the Greeks. After his death in 323, Alexander's Greek generals divided his empire between them, with Ptolemy becoming the ruler of Egypt. The Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt ended with the death of Cleopatra in 30 BC. Egypt then became a province of Rome. So, all the way up to 30 BC, Egypt is now Greek, and it has a Greek reputation and a Greek-Egyptian identity. After the death of Cleopatra, it now becomes dominated by Rome and Roman political policy. It had been created by Hellenistic syncretism, so culturally Alexandria was a Greco-Egyptian city. Now you add in Roman governmental rule, and that rule is supported by 1 million Jews living in Alexandria. And we have a glimpse of the cultural tension created by such a religious, political, and social disparity. You had those that are pro-Egyptian and are going to be pro-Greek together, both against Rome. And here were 1 million Jews, rather than siding with us, the Greeks and the Egyptians, they're siding with the new masters, the Romans. And so if you've got a population that doesn't like Rome, they're not going to like the Jews because the Jews are in cahoots with the Romans. You see the tension that's existing in this city. Let's also mention Philo's family connections. We're just getting the background. Fourth, Philo came from a prominent and wealthy Jewish family. He was well educated and was a leader within the Alexandrian Jewish community. So far as is known, Philo visited the temple in Jerusalem only once in his lifetime. Philo's brother, named Alexander, held various offices for Rome in Egypt and used his money to plate the gates of the temple in Jerusalem with silver and gold, and to make a loan to Herod Agrippa I. Alexander's two sons, Marcus and Tiberius, Philo's nephews, were also involved in Roman affairs. Marcus married Bernice, the daughter of Herod Agrippa I. This is the same Bernice mentioned in Acts chapter 25 and chapter 26. Tiberius Alexander became an apostate from Judaism He held the office of procurator, that's a Roman title, of Judea, and was a free prefect in Egypt. These are Roman governmental officials, positions. And then there were Jewish political connections. Alexandria at the time of Philo was not a city of peaceful intellectual pursuits, happy business enterprise, and cooperation founded on Hellenistic cultural values. It was a place of political, social, religious turmoil. Sounds like the United States in 2024 during a political season, doesn't it? The Jews in Alexandria always knew on which side of their bread was buttered. They knew who would protect them in return for their loyal support: Rome. The Jews had come to the city as mercenaries for the earliest king, who had been Ptolemy, and served also in the militias for or against different Ptolemaic rulers during the period of the Greek rule. For example, in 55 BC, the Jewish militia aided Ptolemy XII, who was affiliated with the Roman commander. Under Cleopatra VII, or her co-regent brother Ptolemy XIII, the Jewish militia acted in support of Roman interests, aiding Caesar in 48 BC, and they were rewarded then by the Romans with certain privileges. After Actium, when Antony was defeated, Cleopatra was defeated, and Caesar Augustus becomes the new Caesar. Augustus apparently thanked the Jews for services they had rendered against Cleopatra and guaranteed the Jews special status and privileges. This loyal service by the Jews that had been rendered to both Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus is indicated in Philo's writings, in which he himself indicates loyalty to Caesar. But good relations with some Ptolemaic rulers and Rome did not spell harmony with the Greco-Egyptians, the Hellenes of Alexandria, especially if they were supporting opponents or candidates to the ones that won. In other words, the Jews are supporting that group and not supporting the nominee of this party or group. In acting for one Ptolemaic ruler against another, the Jews already had created enemies, and anger at the Jews boiled over in terrible attacks against them in 38 and 39 AD, after the time of Christ, where the Roman governor Flaccus is accused of mishandling the situation. It kept getting out of hand. The Alexandrian society was now driven by deep divides, and the Jews found themselves now scorned, ridiculed, and attacked by gangs of the Greek Egyptians population against the Romans, because the Jews were affiliated with the Romans. Alexandrian Greek Egyptians opposed the Roman Jews. From the Hellene perspective, we get a sense of their animosity. Jews in this context are oppressors in league with the Roman authorities, set on violently oppressing the Hellenes. So we've got the battle going on between the Romans and the Greeks between the Jews and the Egyptians. A horrific situation in this foment of difficult ethnicities, religions, and values occurred. You look at the mess you've got. Alexandrians paraded a mentally disabled man named Carabbas as a parody of the Jewish king Agrippa, and then they attacked and killed Jews. They're mocking the Jews, stirring up the people, and then would attack them. The popular accusation that the Jews were actually anti-emperor, that is, anti-Roman, despite their ostensible support and privileges, led to the burning and desecration of synagogues. All of this is in 38 AD. Flaccus is going to revoke the Jews' citizen status, placing them in the class of resident foreigners, immigrants, and move them off to just one area of the city, when they had formerly, prior to this, lived in all of the 5 sectors of the city, though principally they had been in 2 major sections. There is going to be an appeal to the emperor. After the official Flaccus has been removed, Pollio was briefly governor, but the attacks were so severe that both the Jews and the Greek Egyptians sent a delegation to the Roman Emperor Caligula in 39 to 41 AD. Philo was one of the 5 men selected to represent the Jewish community in the embassy, in the delegation to the Emperor Caligula, to face off against the alternative reality presented by the Hellenes. You've got 2 parties that are going to go. Let me tell you how they did it. Let me tell you what they did. So you've got the 2 groups coming before the Roman Emperor Caligula. Josephus, who wrote the history of the Jews after 70 AD, describes how Philo was not ignorant of philosophy and how he led this delegation. Philo was an obvious choice by the Jewish delegation, which one is going to involve a long stay in Rome. As an eminent philosopher, Philo was also the brother of the Jewish oligarch Gaius Julius Alexander. This Alexander was immensely wealthy, so much so that he lent money to Cypros, the wife of the client king Herod Agrippa I. He managed Mark Antony's wife's Antonia's estates. Philo's son Marcus would marry Bernice, as we said previously, the daughter of Agrippa. His other son, Tiberius, would later become the Roman procurator of Judea and then Egypt. The very name of Gaius Julius Alexander indicates Roman citizenship, and by implication, Philo's citizenship as well. So Philo could stand up to the Greek-Egyptian Apion in the debates before Caligula. Philo could stand as both a master of philosophy and a man of reputation from a very good, well-connected, and wealthy family. But the stakes were high. Not only was the fate of the Jews of Alexandria in Philo's hands, but his brother Alexander had done something to anger the Roman official Gaius, and he had put him in jail. clearly sending the delegation itself was a failure. Caligula demanded from Jews that they worship him as a god and accused them of impiety and treason when they did not do so. He was more impressed by the leader of the Greek Egyptians, Apion, against whose work Josephus would write a heated refutation 50 years later. Except for Philo, the Jewish delegation returned without an answer to Alexandria, while Philo remained still waiting for the final decision to be made by the emperor. Philo had to wait until Caligula was assassinated and was replaced by Emperor Claudius, the same one that's mentioned in the book of Acts, before Alexander was released in 41 AD. The accession of Claudius, though a friend to Alexander, did not spell immediately peace for the city of Alexandria. From Josephus, we learn that rioting erupted again on the streets of the city of Alexandria, and it appears that a second delegation was quickly sent now to Claudius. Philo, having remained in Rome throughout this period, from 39 to 41, the assassination of Caligula, etc., while awaiting the emperor's decision, already there now joined the second delegation to the new emperor. The second delegation to the new emperor was much more successful than the first, though not entirely. As a result of this, Claudius issued decrees on the status of the Jews in Alexandria and elsewhere, granting the Jews civic and religious rights, but with the proviso that they should show toleration and cooperation, as if this had been the inherent problem between the Jews and their non-Jewish neighbors. This decree is essentially preserved in a letter dated 10 November 41 AD. The letter still exists, giving Jews key rights but not citizenship, with a warning to Jews not to disrupt athletic contests or look for reinforcements from Syria, that is Palestine. You can't get reinforcements from Palestine or elsewhere in Egypt. We studied this maybe in volume 1 of the Apocalypse study that we did, and we've dealt with all of these issues in Josephus in other classes and seminars, so we're not going to do it again here. The decree by Claudius includes the phrase, because the Jews are in a city not their own. The content of this letter by the Roman Claudius demonstrates that the Hellenes of Alexandria had successfully convinced the emperor that Jews were a socially disruptive force, and that Jews elsewhere, particularly in Judea, Palestine, had come to Alexandria to help their troubled compatriots. We have previously discussed, I just said this, in other episodes that we've taught, the Jewish freedom of religion was not absolute, but was contingent upon living peacefully within the boundaries set for them. All of this is in this. So let's have a summary now on page 30. Philo, born in 20 BC, who died in 50 AD, lived and wrote within the context of the Roman Empire from the time of Julius Caesar establishing a political relationship with the Jews. That happened before Philo, but he's living in the aftermath of that. To Cato's revolt in 115 AD, when Jews in Egypt now rebelled against Rome. So Philo is in between those two, Caesar granting favoritism to the Jews and the ultimate destruction of Judaism in 115 after the 70 AD destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Philo lived his entire life outside of Palestine, though he traveled once to Jerusalem and he traveled to Rome. He lived during the fluid and evolving time of Jewish apocalyptic fanaticism. He died before the fanaticism erupted in that first Jewish-Roman war in 66 AD, in which Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple leveled. Pro-Roman Jewish authorities in Egypt handed over renegade Jews and Jewish fighters to the Romans. The Jews in Alexandria remained loyal to Rome while Jerusalem was being destroyed by the apocalyptic fanatics that had attacked Rome. Pro-Roman sentiments among the Alexandrian Jews eventually gave way as Jewish apocalyptic fanatics, escaping the annihilation of the Jews by Rome in Palestine, made their way to Egypt, their numbers growing stronger year after year. So Alexandria, that had had peace with the Romans, now finds itself infiltrated by the apocalyptic fanatics wanting to bring about the end of the world and set up the Messianic kingdom. After they had allowed the destruction, caused the destruction of Jerusalem and their temple, they've now made their way with their hate and anger and spirit of fight to Alexandria, that's now going to swell and infect the entire Jewish population of Alexandria. That's eventually between 115 and 117 AD allow or come to the point where the Jews in Egypt will revolt themselves against Rome in that Cato's war, and the crisis will become so terrible in the wake of the revolt that most of the Jewish population of Alexandria was driven away or killed. There had been 1 million, and then it was infiltrated. A second or third Jewish war takes place with the infiltrators coming from the island of Cyprus or Cyrene and so forth. And now the Jews in Alexandria are killed and eliminated. It's a story of religion getting along inside a non-religious world. It is a story we can learn from, but it is in the midst of that story that Philo becomes important. This is a lot to absorb, so why don't we take a quick break? We'll come back in just a few minutes. There's some goodies down there, restrooms down the hall, of course, and we'll come back and finish up our session together in just a little bit. Thank you. Well, welcome back after our break. So grateful for each of you being here with us this evening. We pick up our story then on page 30. So what's the point of all of this? So what? You see, Philo did not live in an ivory tower. His writings were not academic treatises to be read by fellow academics. His writings were very practical and written for two specific audiences. On the one hand, the enemies of the Jews mischaracterized the Jewish religious identity in their slanderous attacks on the Jews. Philo wrote his philosophical treatises primarily for non-Jews, determined to show how Judaism excelled in all its piety, righteousness, and philosophical brilliance. His opponent before Emperor Caligula had openly charged that the Jews worshipped a golden ass's head in their temple in Jerusalem, that their word Sabbath derived from the Egyptian word for venereal disease, that annually they kidnapped a Greek, fed him up, fattened him, killed him, and then ate him, while vowing enmity towards all Greeks, that they fomented sedition against the emperor and Rome, and that they had not produced any admirable man, such as inventors of certain technical advances or the transmitting of wisdom, anyone of the likes of Socrates, Zeno, and Cleanthes. On the other hand, against those charges, Philo wrote, on the other hand, not only was he writing for the emperor against those charges, but on the other hand, his second group was to his fellow Jews living outside Palestine. That is, fellow Jews living in Greek-speaking and Greek-thinking culture. He knew he must not only share the Israelite scriptures translated into Greek with his fellow Jews, but he must translate the Israelite experience and identity into the intellectual language of the Hellenistic world. Philo wrote his works on Genesis and Moses in Greek, which was the intellectual language, to make the Israelite scriptures understandable to Greek-speaking and thinking Jews. Philo revealed something of his perspective on both aspects of his life and work by telling of his life studying philosophy and the Israelite scriptures. But this life was interrupted with the vast sea of the cares of public politics, in which I was and still am tossed about without being able to keep myself swimming at the top. However, even in these circumstances, I ought to give thanks to God that though I am so overwhelmed by this flood, I am not wholly sunk and swallowed up in the depths. He didn't lose himself in having to be part of the political world as well. But I opened the eyes of my soul and I am irradiated, enlightened with the light of wisdom. Behold, therefore, I venture not only to study the sacred commands of Moses, but also with an ardent love of knowledge to investigate each separate one of them and to endeavor to reveal and to explain to those who wish to understand them things concerning them which are not known to the multitude. What a mission for his life. It is this concern to reveal what is not generally known about the writings of Moses that permeates most of Philo's literary output. Many of Philo's writings paraphrase the biblical text of Moses. In these, Philo expands the text, giving his own views on various matters. That brings us to a discussion on page 32 of Philo the Hermeneut. We talked about hermeneutics in our first session together. Even in his more philosophical writings, as well as his political apologetic writings, defense of Judaism, even these writings relate to Philo's concern as an exegete of the Pentateuch of Moses, the 5 books. Philo's concern to interpret Moses shows constantly both his deep devotion and commitment to his Jewish heritage, beliefs, and community, and also reflects his unabashed use of philosophical categories and traditions to investigate the biblical text of the Pentateuch. Notice the word interpret. In Philo's concern to interpret Moses in the sentence we just said, it makes all the difference in the world how we understand and use the term interpret. Remember, hermeneutics is interpretation. The Greek word that's translated interpret is from Hermes, the hermeneut. Philo is a hermeneut, an interpreter. Previously in chapter 1, we discussed 2 different a priori approaches to the world. There is the Platonic that says the world is comprised of the seen and the unseen. That's a structure, a paradigm. We don't have to agree with what Philo said the unseen was, but he's saying there is the seen and the unseen, and that makes up reality. Hermes, the interpreter inside that kind of paradigm, brings the message from the unseen to mankind. In the case of Philo and Moses, Moses was the hermeneut. He was the messenger sent by God to give that message from God to mankind. It was Moses then that put that message from the unseen, voice in the bush, into writing. Philo, being our Hermes, our messenger, seeks to go to the text, the book of Genesis, the book of Exodus, goes to what Moses wrote, to start there and stop with that, but to go through it to the unseen that was behind Moses writing it in the first place. That is the Platonic hermeneutic system. We go, here is the written text. We don't just go to it and bounce off. We seek to go through it so that we can come out on this side and experience that voice in the burning bush ourselves as we turn aside in our lives and experience that moment of illumination in our own lives for ourselves. So Philo, being our Hermes, seeks to see through the Mosaic text to that which lies behind, beyond the text itself, and then put into writing what he, Philo, had seen and experienced for himself of the unseen, which had spoken to Moses, and now which Philo had encountered in the process. On the other side, the option, there is the Aristotelian approach to the world, which says there's only the seen. I'm reviewing what we said in chapter 1 in our first episode. Hermes encounters the interpreter, encounters the physical world only, and decides to explain it. I think this is what the physical world is. Then a different hermeneutic. So it's like this. If I can do it this way and save some time in our book together and our time here tonight together. If here was the event, the burning bush, and here was a text that Philo would come to and then see beyond to experience, this would be Platonic. But for Aristotle, there's just the physical world. And so here you are just sitting around and say, oh. And you go, I wonder what that is. So here's the question. And we come up with our own answer. Oh, I think this is what is happening. And so we then make a text out of that. This becomes our text, understanding of a physical piece of dirt or a physical event. It's there. This is what it might mean. So that then now we come to what, if this is Aristotle, what he says, we come to Aristotle. We don't go here. We only go to him, and then we bounce back and tell somebody else, this is what Aristotle said. They get that. They come back. This is what Aristotle said. Or this is what Deacon Ezra said about Aristotle. And then it just keeps going. We just keep talking about, and nobody ever gets beyond the text. The text. Even those that quote the Bible says, they're only with the text. Sola Scriptura is Aristotelian. It just has the text. The text may talk about God, but nobody gets beyond it. It's not designed to get. You don't quote God, you quote the text. Genesis says, or Luke 13 says, or John 3:16. You're just quoting a text. You're never, ever quoting your own experience with the presence of God through the text in that. And you keep doing this until in philosophy, some other person finally comes back to this original object and says, well, I'm going to rethink that. So the world's not flat after all. The world is round. So now we get a whole new set of this, paper after paper after paper, and we're all doing that. Then we say, well, the earth is not the center of the universe. The sun doesn't go around us. So now we've got a whole new set of stuff that's happening. The earth goes around the sun. You see, we change our understanding of the physical because there's no invisible to ever deal with There's only the physical. And that's what science does. I'm not anti-science, but that's what science is. It is a discussion of a physical, visible world and possible explanations of what's happening with it. So which is it? Is Philo a Platonic hermeneutic taking us beyond the text, beyond what Moses said, seeking himself, seeking for us to experience the invisible presence that is accessible through that text? Or is Philo simply an interpreter of an interpreter? An interpreter of an interpreter. This is what Moses said. Well, this is what Philo said. This is what Deacon Ezra said. This is what I say. Nobody ever gets back to here. Which is it? Or is Philo just simply that? After all, according to Aristotle and the world in which we live in 2024, there is nothing behind the text. There is only the text itself. That's just your book. Well, you've got your Bible. The Muslims have the Quran. This group's got its writings, the Bhagavad Gita, this and the Upanishads, etc., etc. Everybody's got a holy book. So why does it all matter? First, it matters if there is something there on the other side of the visible. If there is something there. Others much better than I have discussed these issues. At the very least, the issue of why it matters is the question of truth. Secondly, it matters whether we substitute a text, which is here, for that which is there. Do I have a book instead of God? Do I have a book, even if I call it a holy book? It talks about God, but if that becomes all I've got without the God, I've substituted a book that's here for a God that's there. Now when I say there, I don't mean out there, I mean there, present, here. In that sense, it is a magician's sleight of hand to substitute a text about God for a God who may or may not be there. I can have all kind of, I shouldn't say that, I guess, that anybody can hang out a shingle, get them a camera and a spot on the internet, and can preach any bunch of hooey they want in the name of God, in the name of being Orthodox, answerable to no one, no priest, no bishop, no patriarch, no synod. The sleight of hand. They got the beards, they got the incense, they got the chant, they've got the Bible, they've got their guitars, they've got the drums, whatever it may be, creating some kind of visible experience that we mistake for the invisible experience of the voice in the burning bush. We haven't turned aside. We've attended a production. You see, just because the text, any text, says it is so, does not make it so. Thirdly, it does not matter to those who know God, who know that God is, whether the text says so or not, because they've met Him. They may not be able to express what they've met, but they know they have met the presence. They have experienced the presence. The text points to and is a there that created the text in the first place. It doesn't matter to someone that's had the experience everything we're talking about. The experience trumps the text. However, it matters to the non-believer that's out there and not sitting here in a seminar that's primarily filled with believers. For the non-believer who does not believe there is anything there beyond and behind the physical, that which is there must make itself known. We can't beat somebody else up with a Bible, with a text, to get them to say, I believe there's something on the other side. That's hogwash. It's the experience of the presence of God in our lives that transforms Moses on the backside of nowhere, chasing a bunch of smelly sheep, to being used by God to make the presence of the unknown I am that I am known to the rest of the world, making the experience that he had available to the rest of the world. It makes a difference. In the moment of knowing what he knows, without knowing how he knows, it is that moment that the gift of faith is given and one becomes a believer. Faith is a gift, not something we earn, not something we do, not an intellectual belief, not a text. It is a gift from the invisible one when we turn aside to the bush that's burning. Fourth, the message of the hermeneut. The message the hermeneut receives in his or her encounter will never contain, circumscribe, encapsulate what one knows without knowing how he knows what he knows. The experience of the presence is larger than our capacity to reduce it to a text, to a word. All of our saids leave so much unsaid. And so an experience is filled with the unsaid and the said of our own little understanding of what it was. The experience must be interpreted. It's got to have an understanding. What was that? What just happened? God spoke. I don't know any other words to use. That we translate an experience with the words we have, with the language we have, that's understandable not only to us but to somebody else. The words have to be understandable. They may not understand the experience we're talking about, but they would at least understand the words. That's different than me just beginning to say, I don't know what I just said, you don't know what I just said, and I'm trying to say I had an experience. But that didn't communicate. The message has to be something that the hermeneut experiences and then puts in words that are understandable to who he goes and delivers the message to. That's what we've been dealing with. The children of believers grow up hearing the language of their parents, but they live in a world that is teaching them, our children, a different language. The children may embrace the language of their culture instead of the religious language of their parents. For non-believers, knowing only the language of their secular culture, the hermeneut's message, the preacher, the witness maker, our reports are nonsense. There's nothing beyond the physical. Sixth, if the hermeneut assumes the listener already believes and therefore fails to translate the encounter of the presence, that encounter with the one who is there behind the text, then you're just preaching to the choir. I don't have to say anything. You already know what you believe. I already know we believe. We all believe that this is here. So we'll just talk up here in front. We don't have to worry about that not being there. But when we have visitors in our sanctuary, when we have visitors in our classes, and when our Christian, they do not have this, and it makes a difference whether we're using religious terms, religious language, religious terminology that we understand. We're using a language that our neighbors do not understand. When I say neighbors, I mean the new generation born 50 years after you and me were born, you and I were born. Yeah, the world in my head is not the world my grandkids live in. It's not the world my children live in, let alone my grandkids. The world, culture, has shifted dramatically. If we're only preaching to the choir, we discover that it's a dwindling choir we preach to. And seventh, on the other hand, there is the danger we face that we will make the standard of being understandability by our culture out there. We have to be understandable to them. There is the danger that the encounter with the one who is there drops out. We have to speak here and of this event in an intelligible language and in thought categories that this person can understand and see the possibility of that experience happening. Philo, the biblical hermeneut. Philo is significant for the understanding of first century Christianity, first century Hellenistic Judaism. He is the main surviving literary figure of Hellenistic Judaism of the entire Second Temple period. He is critical for understanding many of the currents, themes, and interpretive traditions which existed in the diaspora and Hellenistic Judaism. Philo confirms the multifaceted character of Second Temple Judaism. The Second Temple, after the Babylonian captivity and before its destruction in 70 AD, that the Jews were not monolithic in being apocalyptic fanatics. They were not monolithic regarding a Messianic kingdom. They were not monolithic regarding the inclusion of Gentiles. They were not monolithic in a multitude of theology and divisions that existed. Judaism, in spite of its concerns for purity and its ethnic identity with references to the law of Moses, also found considerable freedom to participate in many aspects of Hellenic culture, as Philo clearly indicates, learning philosophy, engaging in philosophical thought, engaging in the social and political issues of his day in terms of protecting the religious population. But what kind of hermeneut was Philo? Did he use the Greek language, thought, and culture to proclaim the God who is there? Or did he surrender a God inconceivable to his culture in order to win the acceptance and favor of his culture, to win the cultural acceptance of his brand of Judaism? Put in today's church terms, is the church so interested in reaching our culture that in embracing our culture we've lost the God we worship? This is not an academic issue. What kind of hermeneut Philo was is critical to us if he is to be an example for us on how we can translate and transmit our Orthodox faith to our children and to our non-believing culture. Both. We have the same two groups that Philo dealt with. Children being stolen by culture and by a non-believing culture. Speaking to both. Let us consider only a few examples for ourselves so that we can experience firsthand what kind of hermeneut Philo is as he delivers his message, his interpretation of the biblical text to us. Is Philo only pointing to the thing itself, or is he pointing to the God who is there behind the text? That is, does Philo only see the text, or does he see the God who is there and points to him? Note, the hermeneutical method which Philo employed is often called allegory. He acknowledges the literal as literal, the literal words, the text, but that which stands behind and beyond the literal is known as the allegorical. Now, in today's world, allegorical is just simply saying X equals Y. And what we've done is we've made the allegorical simply translating this literal term for that literal term. This equals that, two literals. However, Philo makes clear he seeks for us to see what is not seen in the literal. And by doing so, Philo will go beyond the allegorical to the mystagogic. Well, we've absorbed, a lot. I know I should be selling Excedrin on the side or giving them away free after having sessions this heavy, I think. God bless you for being here. We're going to stop right there. And in our third episode, we will pick up then Philo, and we're going to actually look at some things Philo says about something Moses wrote as he describes in Genesis events in the life of Abraham. So Philo on Abraham next week in our next session. It's beginning then on page 35. God bless you. Thank you for coming. I look forward to us doing this again, God willing. Thank you.
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the Trinity, one in essence and undivided.